Welcome to the History of Nerds Tonight podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Nicholas Jubber returns to the podcast. Nick actually reached out to me and said, hey, I got a new book coming out. You want to read it? Maybe we'll talk about it. I said, of course. You know, Nick always brings the energy. It's such an easy conversation. And then he told me the name of the book, Monsterland. And in my head, I don't know if anybody else does this. In my head, I'm like, oh my God, this is what I hope the book is, right? Because you never know until you open it up. I open it up. It's exactly what I wanted. It's basically the history of monsters, all the biggest ones that pop in your head. Like, I would like to know where this came from. He does all of that. The book is amazing. As per usual, Nick showed up, brought the energy. I'm so excited for you to hear it. So how about I shut up? Let's talk to Nick. And here we are with author Nicholas Jubber, Monsterland, A Journey Around the World's Dark Imagination. Nick, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you, Brendan. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So let me see, Nick. I have my questions over here. My first question is, what is wrong with you, man? Half of these chapters, you're almost arrested, eaten by something in Europe somewhere. I don't even know. You might die in a mountain from hypothermia. Your poor wife must be scared every time you walk out the door.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a nose for trouble, but it does seem to happen. Although I actually think in my defense that I'm getting in less trouble these days than I have sometimes in the past. I mean, I did a journey across the Sahara where it did get quite hair-raising at times. And then there was one in Afghanistan and Iran, which in fact it was in Uzbekistan where I did get taken into custody and asked an awful lot of questions. So here, you know, I thought with the journeys I did for this one, for Monsterland, that some ways plain sailing. In fact, the place where I felt most in danger, to be honest, was probably in the USA. I don't think it's actually in the book, to be honest. I'd just been attending the Rougarou Fest in Louisiana, which is wonderful. Amazing people in Houma. And then I was going to head down to Mexico to explore stories of La Llorona, the ghost story of Mexico. But in between, I had a friend in Houston who I went to visit. And on the way there to get the bus out, I was in an Uber, which had something wrong with its license plate, and we got stopped by the police. You know, that was a bit of a tricky moment because I only had something like 10 minutes to get to the bus stop to catch my bus. And I was worrying I was going to miss my bus, which would then mean there would be various connectors that I'd miss and I wouldn't get over the border. But of course, you can't say you don't want to be too pushy towards the police when they're stopping you because there's a problem with the car. So I was sort of, really trying my sort of plummiest English accent. Going, excuse me, I'm terribly sorry, but I really do have to hurry. They're going, stay in the car. Eventually they let me out, but they were, hands on triggers and, it was all quite tense. And as I was running off down the street trying to reach the bus station just in time, feeling quite nerve-wracked really. So I was actually quite relieved when I got on the bus to...
Yeah, you're just making my point, because while that part isn't in the book, right before that you almost get arrested for basically vagrancy in New Orleans, in Louisiana.
Yes.
For not having a place to sleep. You're making my point for me because you're bringing up other stuff not even in the book.
Yeah, Louisiana, that was tricky. To be fair, the problem that happened there was that the hotel that I was supposed to be staying in had been struck by a hurricane and it was out of action, but they hadn't stopped taking bookings. So I turned up and I had nowhere, the hotel wasn't there basically, it was there, but it was in disrepair. So I didn't have a place to stay that night. So I thought a bench would do. I mean, I've slept on a lot of benches in my travels. So, I wasn't really, worried about that. And it was quite warm actually, but, the police, wanted me to move on. So I moved on until I met, a more permanent vagrant. And I mean, it's, obviously one of the sad experiences with these, these sort of travelers' tales that you bump into people who are living that kind of life all the time. And that's, something I, try to remember that, however much that may be part of my sort of adventure for a day or two in a particular place, some people obviously are having genuine homeless experiences all the time. I guess, you win the point, that these things do seem to happen to me.
Once we shut off the podcast, I'm going to ask your wife to come back in. We're just going to check on your insurance policies because you are definitely, but you are, when people talk about travel writers, right? I've already talked with you about this. You're a certain breed, and you do make me nervous because it's just part of your personality that you're like, let's go see it. I hope everything turns out fine, but let's go see it, and then we'll figure it out when we get there. And it stresses me out, Nick, is all I'm trying to tell you. So listen, Monsterland, I'm sure people think Monsterland, how much travel do you have to go? You took a book and you just decided to research monsters, but it wasn't enough to just sit there in a library and look at them. You wanted to go places. Where did the germ of this idea come from, and when did you decide this now has to be a book?
Well, I think it was one of those ideas that have been sort of with me in my life for a long time. I mean, I've loved monsters since I was very small, and the monsters have sort of, I guess I'm one of those annoying people who's not quite grown up out of being really excited by monsters. They still fascinate me. But there was a particular moment in about 6 years ago when I went to Bulgaria, and I was researching something else altogether, but I found out about what was known as a monster festival, which happens in the mountains of Bulgaria in certain places, but in one place that I went to, Laka, which is a sort of beautiful, idyllic sort of mountain village. But once a year, it gets turned into a sort of monster venue, and people come dressed in these very traditional outfits with sort of bells rattling around them and horns on the masks on their heads, and these great sort of shaggy woolen outfits. And in many cases, the outfits have been handed down as heirlooms that have gone through many generations, because they've been performing sort of mummery, where they dance and perform a sort of play, a traditional ritual play that has a connection with sort of the changing of the seasons and sort of fertility rites. And they perform it in the village square, and thousands of people gather around, and it's a really sort of respected tradition that's been going on for centuries and possibly for millennia. And I was fascinated to see it. There's this sense of a community gathering around the idea of monsters, and it sort of, I think it got me thinking about this idea that we're supposed to be repelled by monsters. We're supposed to be scared of them, and yet actually they're often a community focal point. There's something that draws people in. It's the same with storytelling, that when people have been sitting around the half places for thousands of years saying, hey, let's hear a story of the bogeyman, let's hear a tale of the dragon, let's hear a story of the monster coming out of the fens or the mountains or the wild places. So that's something that's sort of universal, I think, across many different societies. And I wanted to explore just how universal that is, but also how those stories change according to different communities, different histories, different environments. But it really came starting off from that idea of communities sort of being glued together by monsters, that the monsters are actually, in some ways, the thing that binds us.
And it's just not that one chapter. It seemed like something that blew my mind. There are a lot of communities that have these types of festivals that are built around some type of, and we should probably define it, but it's not just that one thing that you went to. There's a lot of places where it's ingrained in the culture, and it's an actual party that they want to have around a specific monster.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, in many cases, these go back for centuries and have been continuously done. So, for example, in Germany, in Bavaria, there's a place, Fürstenwald, where they have a dragon festival. And when I say a dragon festival, I mean, this is the mother of dragon festivals. They have thousands of people just taking part, dressing up in medieval garb. They decorate wagons that are specially created to look like sort of medieval wagons, and all kinds of medieval weaponry, and they even have sort of animals draped around their various vehicles. And then as the sort of the big sort of coup de théâtre of the whole thing, they have this huge dragon, which is the world's largest walking robot, made for millions of euros by various companies, including, I think, the German space company, and I think it's Magicon, the company that did the special effects for the Harry Potter movies. And it's an incredibly impressive beast. And it goes along the streets and it sort of parades all around this town, and everybody comes out to cheer it on. And of course, they're interested to see their mate from round the block in a sort of furry pelt and carrying a spear. But what everybody really wants to see, of course, is the dragon. And they really give it a big cheer. And then there's a show that's put on where all by local people, and there's a local guy who's chosen as being the knight, the sort of St. George sort of figure, who's called Udo in their version, and a young woman who's chosen as the Lady Maria, who is the princess who in the original version is sort of being rescued by St. George. But as time has gone on, and this is one of the interesting things with monster stories, I think, is how the stories evolve around. The monsters may not necessarily change, but the stories evolve around them. And so now the story, when I saw it, was about Maria bringing the people in, the refugees who are fleeing from the dragon, and helping to save everybody, whilst her beloved Udo is away fighting another war before he finally comes back to thrust his spear into the dragon's throat. It's a huge community event that, you know, that really defines this area and is so significant to it that this town, Furfenbad, is known as the Dragonstadt, the town of dragons.
I have to feel like for a lot of books, you've got to go out and do that research and you hope there's enough there. It seems like this book would have the exact opposite. How do you define monster, and then how do you whittle down that list and not make this a 2,000-page book? Where do you start with that as far as you're concerned? Because, I mean, listen, let's just reestablish your credit. I know you said you're a kid who has not grown up, loved monsters, but you're not just saying that. Monsters were part of your wedding, weren't they?
They were, yes. Yes. Oh, thanks so much for bringing that up, Brendan. When we were getting married, and actually, to be fair, this was my wife's idea, we decided to name the tables at our wedding after monsters. I think we'd been having one of our discussions, which I think is the sort of thing I can probably say on a podcast with the word nerds in the title. We were having a discussion, I think, about, you know, whether it was, you know, whether the Cybermen from Doctor Who or the Borg from Star Trek were you know, which one would win. We both enjoy fantasy literature and monsters and stories of monsters. So we thought, yeah, that would be a really cool thing to name the tables after at our wedding. And we hadn't seen it done at any other wedding. And it was really fun then choosing who would go into which monster, you know, who gets to be put with the orcs, who goes with the Borg, who goes with the Daleks, and so on. You know, where do you put your in-laws?
Where did you put them? You're willing to admit that on a podcast?
Well, the thing is that you can't really, I mean, the good thing about if every table's named after a monster, you're going to be a monster wherever you are. So
how do you whittle down that list? Because anybody can just sit there and just start listing off something. Like I said, that's a 5,000-page book, if not more.
Yeah.
How did you decide this is what I'm going to do? Did you just kind of Google and said, let's see where a monster comes up in some place I want to go, actually see? Or were there specific ones that you said, they've got to be in there?
Yeah, I think there are different ways that it develops. So there's a long period, many months of research, sort of planning the journeys. Partly it was from thinking about what is the meaning of monster, and looking at the words for monster in different cultures. Obviously in English we have monster, which comes from the Latin monstro, to show, and it's that sense of something that manifests, that displays itself. And there are other interpretations of that term as well. In Arabic they use the term wash, which means a sort of it refers to abandonment or desolation. I think in Chinese guaiwu, which sort of says something about weirdness or weird creatures. The Japanese term bakamano says just shape-shifting and so on. So there's all these different terms, and I always try to sort of move out beyond the sort of Anglophone sort of identification to look at how these ideas sort of are reflected on in different places around the world, and whether there are resonances and parallels there or differences. So it was partly out of trying to come up with a sort of international framework of looking at what monsters are, but then also looking at it chronologically through the ages, and thinking, like, if you were to divide up monsters between now and then, how would you do it? And the sort of structure that I came up with was to look at 4 different sort of periods. So one was sort of going back to very ancient monsters, the idea of monsters as being these sort of manifestations of wild places, coming out of the very ancient conception of monsters as being godlike and almost being indistinguishable from gods. And slowly over ancient societies, these stories that were being told, the sort of, you know, dragon slayer stories of the monster that comes out of the wild, and the hero who then stands up to defend human society from the monster. And I think a lot of those stories come out of it's a demonization of the wild. It's a sense of the wild, of nature being scary and being everything that needs to be sort of controlled and then harvested and used and sort of put under human domination. But also that the fascination of it, the splendor of it. I mean, if you look at a dragon, it's such an ambiguous thing, because it's and it is differently, it's conceived differently in different societies. I mean, in Western societies, dragons were often traditionally seen as malevolent, but if you go into East Asia and China especially, you know, it's dragons are often forces of great benevolence, or blessing at least, which I think says something both about history and society, and also about landscape and just things like rainfall. But gradually we sort of move into then another section of the book, which is about shapeshifters, and about how different monsters that can be human but are also something other. to then looking at monsters as emanations of the dead. And I think there we have, I think the Shapeshifters, a lot of those stories are sort of coming out of sort of medieval fascination for shape-shifting. But then gradually, as science develops, as human society's sort of ability to control or to feel like we have a bit more control over what happens to our bodies, over nature itself, and over stemming death, you then go into that sort of Gothic period where there was this absolute fascination for these sort of figures of the dead, for vampires and zombies and all these sort of creatures coming out of experimentation with death. And then you go through to the sort of modern and postmodern monsters, which I think begins with, for me, it begins with Frankenstein and Mary Shelley's novel, and that sense that the monster is no longer a force of a sort of supernatural force, but is something that actually humans are creating themselves. And so then you have things like robots and then the sort of kind of postmodern hybrid monsters that developed over the last few decades, of monsters that are often a mixture of some force of nature along with sort of human hubris. So in the one that I've chosen to end the book with is Godzilla, because you have this sort of ancient prehistoric beast, this sort of dinosaur of the deep, but it's also been supercharged by the atomic war and by human science to become the ultra deadly creature that then can shoot these sort of rays, these sort of atomic rays down on the cities that it trashes. So the sort of structure of the book is an attempt to, and a quixotic attempt. I mean, it's, attempt sort of doomed to fail, I think, because you can't pin monsters down. But the sort of argument that I'm making in the book is that it's by trying to pin them down that we find out what they're like. And as they burst those barriers, we see what their powers are. Because otherwise, as you say, I would end up writing a book that would just go on and on and on for, thousands of pages. And I'd never heard of a publisher that would be very likely to accept that manuscript.
I was just thinking, you mentioned it, and it comes up every time I hear Frankenstein. Being a history nerd, I know who wrote it, when she wrote it, why, and all of that stuff. It's just so damn humbling to think about what I've done in now 43 years of life and realizing that this teenager, basically a weekend party, decided to write a horror story on a whim, and it becomes an all-time classic. Every time I think about it, I'm like, I need to get going, man, because I'm way behind Mary Shelley. She killed it right off the bat.
It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? And she's just the most extraordinary person. And, I sort of get goosebumps thinking about her life and how she was able to create that novel. I think she's one of those people that, if I could go back in time, it would just be really fascinating to meet her. I think Mary Shelley is somebody who you could never sort of praise enough what she managed to achieve. She was so young, and to come up with that story, it's one of those genuinely original stories that it has such an influence on everything that went after. But, find something before that really paves the way for Frankenstein. Yes, there are, there's an absolute ton of influences on it, and lots of scholarship has been written on the influences behind Frankenstein, but it is, as a story itself, it's very, very, very much something new. It's extraordinary to think that she was basically running away from home with her lover and her half sister and then this dreadful aristocratic friend of theirs, and in this house with these storms going on, with the darkest light of recorded history at the time, with so many sort of strange sort of natural phenomena at the time, which must have had an influence on her. And she came up with this remarkable story, and then developed it into a novel and wrote it. And of course, the story was one of the. I don't think it was quite the sudden sort of spark of genius that it was sort of presented as in the sort of romantic imagination. But in some ways, I think the achievement is that she then was able to sort of sit down and rewrite it until it could come out as a novel. And then, of course, it was rejected by all the respectable publishers and brought out by quite a small press called Lackington Press, and wasn't expected to really do very well until the people really took to it and bought it in their droves. And there's a lovely sort of letter, I think, that Percy Shelley received from one of his friends saying, I was at the races the other day and everybody's talking about Frankenstein. I love the idea of all these 19th century people at the races, sort of with their betting slips and everything, going, "Have you read Frankenstein? What a marvel it is!" But lots of other people were criticizing it and saying, "Oh, it's an absolutely dreadful book." And of course, they thought it was particularly abhorrent that it had been written by a woman. And then many of them thought, "Oh, well, it must have been written by Percy Shelley because, of course, he was the famous poet." But in fact, that seems very unlikely, since he never wrote anything else that's even close to Frankenstein. Whereas Mary wrote other fantasy and science fiction novels, including one called The Last Man, which is about an apocalypse, and I think was inspired partly by the fact that so many of the people around her died. And it's, The Last Man is literally, everybody dies. So she definitely had a very morbid imagination. But I suppose in some ways, you say, "Oh my God, how could we ever achieve something that as she did so young?" But I think also that Frankenstein must have been in some ways, well, to use an analogy from one of the poets that she knew from Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, it's like an albatross around her neck that she could never really match it. It would have been impossible, I think, to produce anything quite as spectacular as that again. And so it's a story that must have haunted her throughout her life, and a story that I think she had very mixed views about, because it was written and conceived in the happiest time of her life, when she was in love with Percy Shelley. They were, this young couple having this sort of gloriously romantic adventure together. But it was only a few years later that he tragically died drowned at sea after visiting Byron. Byron turned out to be, I think it's fair to say, at least in terms of how he related to Mary and her friends, he turned out to be a really nasty piece of work. Her sister Claremont, who's one of those completely forgotten characters, but I think actually is a really interesting and quite wonderful figure in literary history, didn't have the talent of Percy or Byron or Mary, and so is sort of overshadowed by them all. But she stood her ground against them, and she wrote afterwards, because she outlived all of them. She wrote, "You were all a bunch of monsters," but especially Byron, who took her daughter away to a convent where she died. So it's quite it's a very mad sort of world, quite a topsy-turvy world, and it's out of that sort of that extraordinarily chaotic, brilliant masterpiece was made.
And you hit on it, which kind of really helps put into perspective, especially the rest of the book, that she took something that she saw and you walk it through this castle she saw, and that became a piece of it. And it makes complete sense when you sit back and think about it. But when you're looking at monsters, you're not thinking this deeply about it. The monsters that really stick with people, they're tied to something that gives people anxiety, whether, especially for the earlier monsters, it's about geography. If you live on the ocean, that monster is probably going to be in the ocean. If you live near the mountains, they're up in the mountains. Or, if you're on the side of the woods, it's coming out of the woods. Was that something you kind of knew going in, and that you were going to build around that? Or did that become way more obvious to you as you started going back in time to figure out where these things came from?
Yeah, I think that sense of the importance of geography was there fairly early on, but it was something that the more I traveled into these stories, the stronger I felt that this was really a big part of the monster story. I mean, we find it even with Mary Shelley, actually, because I think one of the things about Frankenstein is that it's a weird love letter to Switzerland. She was very happy in Geneva, in Switzerland, or at least as happy as a sort of gothically minded romantic writer could be. But she travelled there after escaping from England and from all sorts of issues going on in England, travelling across France, which had basically been sort of depleted by the Napoleonic Wars, and then suddenly arriving in Switzerland. And in her memoirs, her travel memoirs, her writing absolutely soars as they get into Switzerland. She describes these incredible mountains. She keeps saying that the imagination cannot encompass the majesty of these mountains. She was really, really fascinated by the mountains, and I think Percy was as well. That in Frankenstein, although it's a story about a monster that is created in a garret in the city of Ingolstadt, where the monster really comes to life is in the mountains, when it moves to the mountains and then it eavesdrops on a family who live in the mountains, and it then develops its sort of human side of its personality. It learns speech, he learns, about the world. And then he confronts his creator in what I think is the most important scene in the book, when he meets Victor and he says to him, "Look, you created me, you have responsibility for me," which is the absolute sort of philosophical core of the novel, and that happens in the mountains. And so I think that the mountains really inspired Mary in creating that monster, and I think that's really telling that this is a monster that one author imagined, but we can take that idea across all monsters really, that monsters are always imagined out of some kind of element, natural force, natural environment.
Let's just do a quick sampling. I'm just going to ask random monsters. You pick which one based upon the book. In actually exploring the areas where these monsters came from, which area did you feel most nervous around? Which one unnerved you the most? Was there anywhere you're like, I feel something here and I want to go home?
I think it would probably be vampires, because I put myself in the...
That would have been my guess, for the record.
...scariest situation with them. Yeah. So there, I went to... Obviously, vampires are particularly associated with Transylvania, and I thought, well, there's been a lot about, Romania and the vampires, so I'm going to look elsewhere. And I went back to the early European vampire stories. And of course, vampire stories go back across sort of centuries and millennia, depending on how you identify them. But the word vampire, as it is in the English language, really comes into our language in the 17th and 18th century, particularly in the sort of periodicals of the 18th century, when there was what was known as the vampire craze, as there were these reports of vampire outbreaks happening across the Balkans. And the first one is in a small place called Kringa in Croatia. And then there are more that happened in Serbia. And so I went to one of the Serbian places which is associated with a vampire called Sava Savanovic, a vampire so famous for that area that the mill which he was supposed to haunt still exists, and sort of is a sort of untouched place in that landscape, sort of over a river, under a gorge, where the cliffs are actually known as the vampire's teeth, because you've got these big jagged sort of basaltic cliffs soaring up over the woodland. And I thought, well, I've got to go there. And then, to be honest, I did look into whether there was an Airbnb or something nearby, but I couldn't find any. And so I thought, well, they say there is this mill here, which is basically a public place open to people to visit, said to be haunted by the vampire. The story that I'm reading is about a man who goes to sleep in the mill one night in order to confront the vampire. So if that's the story I'm exploring, then I should probably go and spend a night in the vampire's mill.
No one thinks that but you, Nick. No one. Can I just point out too, and I remember this part of the book very, very clearly, there were locals around who looked at you and were kind of like, what are you doing? Go, you should not be here. When the locals are telling you to leave, Nick, you should be listening.
Well, they didn't say you shouldn't stay here over the night. I think they were too busy getting into their cars and driving off, actually.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have to physically say it, Nick. They kind of let you know.
They were probably right. So I did stay in the mill. I thought, well, it's going to be one of these tests. The thing is that I don't believe in vampires. So I thought, well, if I stay in this mill, I'm going to test that, like how much I don't believe in vampires. And what I discovered was that I probably do believe in them a little bit. When it's dark at night, you're hearing sort of strange sounds in the woods. I believe there is some, I felt like there was something out there. And it wasn't like I thought there's some terrible supernatural force that is going to come in here, suck my blood and transform me into the living dead. I just felt scared, because I'm on my own in the middle of a wood in a mill that's said to be haunted, with all these sort of stories going around in my head, and sort of noises, little noises in the roof of the mill. And then every so often there'd be a noise of a motorbike or something going past. And it was humans that probably scared me the most, actually. The thought that, you never know who's going to turn up in the middle of the night. And it was that experience of fear that I went there to test and to challenge. And I was really glad that I did that, but I wasn't glad, obviously, during the course of that night, because I was just, wrecking myself. But I was very, very glad when the first sign of light appeared over the top of the jagged vampire cliffs of the mountain, and I was able to make my way back to the main road.
All right, let's go to the complete opposite side. Let's go optimistic. I have enough money to go to one monster festival. I can only do one. Which one do you say you got to go to?
Oh, well, if it was one, I'd probably recommend the Dragon Stick in Bavaria, because it's just such a sumptuous and spectacular sort of communal gathering. But I've already mentioned it and said a little bit about it. So another one that I would recommend, which would probably be closer to you, would be the Rougarou Fest in Louisiana. And I think that's a really fun event as well, and a great sort of...
And for the listeners, what is a Rougarou?
So the Rougarou is a sort of, it's most obviously described as a werewolf, but I know there are people who say that you can't say it's necessarily a werewolf. But it goes back to the old French term of the loup-garou, which is usually translated as a werewolf, and it's that idea of, that's the most sort of common visual image of it, of a sort of a man or a person anyway who transforms through a curse into a wolf, and if you get bitten by them, then you'll become a rougarou as well. But there are ways to combat that. You can prick the rougarou with a knife. You can't use a silver bullet on them, but you can prick them with a knife, and if you make them bleed, then they will transform back into a person, actually.
Now, I haven't been to that festival, but I have been very, very drunk in Louisiana, so I can recommend that. I can back up your recommendation for that as far as having a good time in Louisiana. Just make sure you can actually get a hotel that is still letting people stay in it, would be kind of your recommendation, right?
I think that's probably a good tip, yeah.
Okay, good. Excellent. All right, from the monsters in your book, you're going to run into one in a dark alley. All right. Now, none of them are good answers, but if you had to choose one to run into a dark alley, which one would it be?
Well, I feel like you could have a conversation with Frankenstein's monster, so maybe
it would at least be interesting before he might kill you.
I think he's lonely. He wants to be loved. So I think you could probably say, "Hey, Frankie, sit down. I think you're okay. I'm not going to shout and scream at you." I mean, the rougarou, I feel like you can escape from, because there is that, if you just make sure you've got like a switchblade on you or something. But you've got to, if you make them bleed, then they will. You may not be able to do that when you've got this sort of massive sort of vulpine head coming towards you with savage teeth and looks like it's about to bite your head off. But if you can do that, then you're going to be safe, as long as you don't tell the secret for I think, is it 101 days, which is quite a long time to keep a secret, obviously. So there are problems with that.
Now, your publisher comes to you and says, "I will give you a blank check to write a monster book, a monster novel." What monster would you choose for it?
Well, if a publisher came to me with a blank check, I think I'd probably have a heart attack. Yes, so I'd probably have to return as the living dead to write the story. One of the chapters in the book is about the Selki, which is the stories from Orkney and from all over Northern Europe. There are these wonderful stories of the seals that could turn into people. And the sort of classic tale is of the sort of young man who's a bit lonely in life, and he goes to the shore, and then he sees these seals sort of coming into the shore and then turning into these beautiful young women and then dancing on the shoreline, and usually naked. And then he steals one of the skins that are their seal skins that will turn them back into seals. And so then the girl whose skin he's stolen has to come back with him and marry him, and she lives with him for about 7 years, and they have children, and she brews the best beer in the island until eventually she's able to catch her skin back and then go back to the sea, because that's her natural element where she wants to go. And I think there's a lot of interesting layers to these stories. There's often this sense of the Selki, this shape-shifting character who she's trapped in human society, but she wants to go out back to the sea to escape from them, even though she's got a family there now. But she's always drawn to her natural element, and she goes through this sort of melancholy as she looks out to the sea. So there's all these sort of interesting things that you can play with, I think, with the character of the Selki and with her relationship with her husband, which must be quite a tense one. Something like that would probably make quite an interesting novel.
The one I learned the most about, I don't know if you knew about it, can you tell me about, and I'm hoping I'm saying it right, Sidi Ali?
Yeah, Sidi Ali in Morocco, yeah. The jinn I've always loved stories of the jinn, sort of going back to reading the 1001 Nights. And I was interested to, because I spent quite a bit of time in Arabic countries and had always wanted to learn more about those kind of tales. And once you delve into them, you find there's so many different tales. And the ones in the 1001 Nights are in some ways not very representative, because a lot of the jinn are really creepy, strange, complex characters in much of the folklore. And so the one that I looked into there was the story of Aisha Kandisha, who appears as this sort of beautiful woman and sort of lures her victims towards her, and then transforms into this terrifying monster that sort of sucks their minds out before destroying them, or turns them into her servant in some way, and then they're sort of walking zombies who have to sort of follow her every rule. And it's a story that goes right back, it goes back across the centuries, but it's pinned especially in history to the period of the Portuguese invasions in the sort of 15th, 16th century. So there's a festival that goes on in Sidi Ali. And when I say festival, I mean, this is very different from the sort of Rougarou Fest or even the Dragon Stick. It's where people gather in a mountain in Morocco, and they gather in this village, which is associated with a Sufi saint. And people who have been troubled in their minds will go there to be, well, the word we would use is to be exorcised, to have that trouble, that dark spirit taken out of them. And there are people who are believed to be sort of expert practitioners in helping people to sort of recover their sanity or their sense of self. And I went along there, and it happens in around a shrine, the shrine to this Sufi saint who was said to be somebody who was expert at battling against the jinn and sort of rescuing people from troubles with them. And people circle around his tomb and they pray to God, but around the tomb of the saint. And there are various rituals that take place. I mean, one of them involves people hitting their heads very hard with a knife until they bleed. But there are others involving music and what I guess we would see as sort of musical therapy, and others which are just about people gathering together and sort of praying and reflecting. But between all these rituals, there does seem to be some success for some people in being able to recover from whatever ailment they're suffering from. And I met a few of them and, heard some very moving stories about how they felt that they had been sort of had this sort of some badness inside them sort of extracted. But then you also hear, of course, stories of how some people can be exploited in some of these places, and there's a lot of different sides to it, a lot of different layers to it. But it was very interesting just to see that and to experience it and to get that sense of how, in different ways, in different cultures, people are dealing with sort of the enemy within. The monster. The worst thing about monsters is that sense of the monster within us all. That we've all got that potential to find a monster in us or to be a monster, and how do we sort of try to rescue ourselves from that?
Now, we should mention before anybody buys their tickets or anything to go there, you also had to be kind of aware of where you were and if you were supposed to be there or not, specifically around this time, right? Because there's just certain places that an outsider is not supposed to go, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a place that it's not advertised as something, certainly for for mass tourism. And I was wary of going to this place and going to attend the Mosum of Sidi Ali and to witness these rituals. But I spoke to a lot of people in Meknes, which is an area sort of big city to it, who said, you should go and see this, if you're interested in it and, you want to learn about what goes on with the jinn and the reality of how people sort of experience the jinn, then this is a place to go. And I was lucky enough to make friends with somebody who sort of helped and sort of guided me in there.
We already talked about Mary Shelley, so I'm taking her off the board. Is there any historical figure from this book that if you could magically talk with them, who would it be? Who would you pick out of everybody in this book? They have to have actually existed.
Ooh. Somebody who I'd love to have met or to be able to go back in time and meet is Karel Čapek, who lived in Czechoslovakia, as it was called at the time, and wrote the first story of robots, or coined the term. Him and his brother coined the term of robot for his play Rossum's Universal Robots, which is this wonderful play from the 1920s about a robot revolution where these synthetic beings are created by this company living on an island and sort of away from the rest of the world, and they gradually become more and more popular, and orders are sort of increase all over the place to sort of have them distributed everywhere until they take over the world and then obviously kill everybody. And all the humans are killed until, by the end of the play, it's pretty much, down to the last person standing. It's a story that's been retold ever since. Isaac Asimov and sort of so many of the great sci-fi writers have retold that story. But Karel Čapek really did put down a definitive version of that tale. And he gave us that term, robot. It was suggested to him actually by his brother Josef, who was also an author and a painter as well. And Karel Čapek had, I think, a really interesting life. He was a writer of novels and poems and stories and plays, and was very successful as a playwright in his era. He was many times, it was a contender for the Nobel Prize. knew a lot of the sort of movers and shakers of Czech society at the time. And the Czech nation was very much it was a very new nation at that time. I mean, it's an ancient nation, an old nation, but also with the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was newly independent. So there was a lot of exciting things going on at that time. And he wrote these sort of wonderfully satirical, fantastical tales. Another of his most famous stories is called The War with the Newts, which I thoroughly recommend. It's a sort of great sort of satirical tale about another sort of takeover of human society. And he stood his ground on the things that he believed in, including about sort of freedom of speech and standing up against fascism. And that was really quite a real situation for him, because he died just around the time of the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Germany. So he was writing sort of fables about humans standing up against tyranny and sort of various variations upon that theme. But he was also experiencing those things in real life. So if I was to visit him, I probably would want to time it very carefully, because I think the 1920s would be probably the time to meet him.
Now, it's monsters. As we all know with monsters, there are sequels. Should we be expecting Monsterland Part 2 anytime soon? Do we have to wait and see how this one does? Or do you think as soon as I said Monsterland Part 2, did you already say, oh, here's the 10 monsters that would be Part 2?
Yeah, I think you're going to have to buy a lot of copies first.
Well, Nick, I can't believe that people might not think that this sounds awesome, but just to put a pin in it, you know what I ask at the end of this? Some people are like, there's a little bit of history, a little bit of travelogue, nonfiction's not really my thing. If I sat one of those poor misguided souls in front of you and they said, why should I read Monsterland? What would you say?
Well, yeah, I think that it's about having that sense of adventure and the magic that you might get out of a good novel. And I obviously trying with the nonfiction that I write to bring all those elements into it, but you're also learning a lot of stuff about the real world. And one of the things that I discovered in the course of writing this book was I started off thinking I was writing a book about mythology and about folklore. And I realized as I was going through it that I was also writing very much about history. So a lot of these stories of monsters, they're kind of folk memories of really big moments in history. So, for example, the ghost of Mexico, La Llorona, goes back to the Spanish conquest of Mexico, and it's a memory of what was lost and the trauma of what Mexico went through when what the Aztecs and Aztec society went through when the Spanish arrived. So these stories that seem to be sort of fantastical figments of a popular imagination, but they're also saying something about the world that we live through. And the whole book was an attempt to sort of track our way through the whole of human history. So yeah, there's a lot there, I hope, and that mixture of storytelling with history and fact. And I hope that's a blend that a lot of people will enjoy.
Well, Nick, I think you nailed it. I loved it. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Brendan. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
And that's it for this episode. Nick, thank you so much. Monsterland, it is fantastic, people. You don't have to be a history nerd. You're gonna love it. Trust me. In the meantime, hit us up, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History